It was a chilly autumn night, and the only sounds that filled the air were the rustling of leaves and the occasional howl of a distant dog. Julie had always been a bit of a daredevil, so when her friends dared her to take a shortcut through the old abandoned neighborhood, she didn't hesitate. As she walked down the empty streets, she felt a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The old, dilapidated houses looked creepy in the moonlight, and she couldn't help but think that she was being watched. She quickened her pace, trying to get through the neighborhood as quickly as possible. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. She took a deep breath and continued on her way, her eyes searching the darkness for any sign of danger. As she walked, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until she was sure that someone was following her. She turned to confront her pursuer, but there was still no one there. She was about to start running when she heard a voice whisper her name. She turned around, her heart pounding, but there was still no one there. She took a step back, her hand searching for her phone in her pocket. She dialed 911, but the line was dead. She was trapped, with no way to call for help. As she stood there, frozen with fear, she heard the voice whisper her name again. It was coming from one of the old, abandoned houses. She took a step towards the house, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The darkness inside was absolute, and Julie could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She took a few steps forward, her hand searching for a light switch. Suddenly, she heard a rustling behind her, and she spun around. There was a man in the corner, his face hidden in the shadows. Julie screamed, but the man simply stood there, his eyes never leaving her. She backed away, her hand still searching for her phone, but it was gone. The man took a step forward, and Julie could finally make out his face. He was covered in dirt and grime, and his clothes were torn and tattered. He looked as if he had been living in the abandoned house for years. Julie realized that she had stumbled into a homeless man's shelter. She started to apologize, but the man simply stood there, his eyes never leaving her. Julie was scared, but she was also relieved. She started to back away, when the man suddenly lunged forward, his hands reaching for her. She screamed and ran for the door, but the man was too quick. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers sinking into her flesh. Julie struggled, but the man was too strong. He dragged her deeper into the darkness, his fingers still digging into her skin. She screamed for help, but no one came. The man was a homeless veteran, suffering from PTSD and paranoia. He had been living in the abandoned house for years, and he saw Julie as a threat to his sanctuary. She was trapped, with no way to escape, until a police officer finally heard her screams and rescued her. The experience left Julie shaken, but she was grateful to be alive. She learned that the world can be a frightening place, and that it's important to always be aware of your surroundings. From that day on, she never took shortcuts again. There was a young woman named Sarah who lived in a small town surrounded by dense, dark woods. She was an adventurous and curious person, often exploring the outskirts of her town. One day, she decided to take a walk in the woods, wanting to experience the thrill of being in nature. As she walked deeper into the woods, she soon realized she was lost. The dense trees and shrubs made it difficult for her to determine which direction she had come from. She tried to retrace her steps, but everything looked the same. She pulled out her cell phone, but there was no signal. Sarah was completely cut off from civilization. As the night started to set in, Sarah became increasingly frightened. The dense canopy overhead cast ominous shadows, and the sounds of the forest were eerie and unfamiliar. She could hear the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig, but she couldn't see what was causing the sounds. Sarah decided to build a fire and wait until morning, when she could see better and hopefully find her way back home. But as she gathered twigs and sticks, she heard a low growl coming from the darkness. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the glowing eyes of an animal in the shadows, watching her every move. She lit the fire, the flame casting flickering shadows on the trees around her. She huddled close to the fire, her eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of danger. Suddenly, she heard a woman's voice whisper her name. She spun around, but there was no one there. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just the wind. But then she heard it again. The voice was louder, more urgent, and it was coming from the direction of the animal she had seen earlier. She started to panic, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. She picked up a stick, brandishing it as a weapon, and slowly started to make her way towards the voice. As she walked, she could see the shadows of trees stretching towards her, like fingers trying to grab her. The growl grew louder, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the edge of a clearing, and she saw the source of the growl. It was a pack of wolves, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. She took a step back, her hand shaking as she raised her stick. The wolves started to circle her, their growls growing more intense. Suddenly, she heard a scream. It was the voice she had heard earlier, and it was coming from a small cottage in the center of the clearing. Sarah knew she shouldn't go near the cottage, but she couldn't ignore the woman's scream. She took a step forward, her hand still gripping the stick. As she approached the cottage, the wolves started to growl more fiercely, but they didn't attack. She pushed open the door to the cottage, and what she saw inside made her blood run cold. The cottage was covered in cobwebs and dust, and there was a woman tied to a chair in the center of the room. The woman was gagged, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah approached her, but before she could untie her, she heard a voice behind her. "Don't move," the voice said. Sarah spun around, and she saw a man in the shadows, holding a knife. He was the one who had tied the woman up, and he had been using her screams to lure people into the cottage so he could capture and kill them. Sarah was trapped, with no way to escape. The hours passed, and Sarah was growing weak from exhaustion and hunger. She was starting to lose hope when she heard a sound that filled her with relief. It was a search party, calling her name. She screamed and yelled, and the search party finally found her. They took her back to safety, but Sarah was forever changed by her experience in the haunted woods. She was grateful to be alive, but the memory of that dark and foreboding place stayed with her. From that day on, she never ventured into the woods again. The haunted woods were a reminder of the dangers that lay in the world, and she was content to leave it be.